The coffee had gone cold by the time I noticed. That happens more than I'd like to admit these days. I'll pour a cup, set it on the counter while I look for something, and by the time I remember it, the warmth is gone. My daughter-in-law used to point that out like it meant something. "You forgot your coffee again, Nadine." Said it the way a doctor reads off symptoms. My name is Nadine. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years teaching high school English, which means I know exactly when someone is building a case against you. One small observation at a time. I just didn't expect my own son to be the one doing it. My son's name is Clark. He's 41, works in insurance, and has his father's jaw and his grandmother's stubbornness. I raised him in this house. The white one on Clemson Street with the yellow shutters I painted myself the summer his father left. Clark grew up doing homework at the kitchen table I still use, watching television in the same living room where I now sit alone most evenings with a book and whatever's left of my dignity. His wife is Petra. She came into his life about 6 years ago, and I genuinely tried, to like her. She is not an easy woman to like. She smiles with her mouth and watches with her eyes. And she has an opinion about everything, especially things that aren't hers to have opinions about. Things like my house. It started small. That's how these things always start. Last spring, Clark stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual. He normally calls first. He walked in through the back door without knocking. He still has the key I gave him years ago for emergencies, and I was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with my gloves on, transplanting some begonias I've been keeping in pots all winter. "Mom," he said, standing at the back door, "you should be careful out there. The ground's still uneven from the frost." I looked up at him. "I've been gardening since before you were born." He smiled in that patient way that wasn't really patience, more like tolerance. "I know. I just worry." I should have paid more attention to that smile. The next visit was 3 weeks later. This time Petra came too. She brought a dish, some kind of pasta bake, and set it on my counter like she was doing me a favor. While I was putting it in the refrigerator, I heard her open the cabinet under the sink. "Looking for something?" I asked. "Just checking if you need anything under here. Clark said the pipes gave you trouble last winter." "The plumber fixed the pipes in February," I said. "I handled it." She nodded slowly. "That's slow." Considering nod. "Of course you did. That was the first time I felt it. The particular chill of someone deciding something about you that you haven't agreed to." A few weeks after that, Clark called to say he'd been doing some reading. About estate planning, about how it might be smart. "For me," he said, "for my peace of mind. If I signed over a financial power of attorney. Just in case something happened, just so someone could manage things if I ever couldn't." "I can manage things perfectly well," I said. "I know you can, Mom." The patience again. "It's just a precaution." I told him I'd think about it. I did not tell him that I'd already heard this argument twice. Once from Petra's direction, thinly disguised as concern for my long-term comfort, and once from Clark in a tone so rehearsed I could practically hear her coaching him from the other room. I started paying closer attention after that. I noticed that they called more often, but the calls felt like checkpoints. "How are you sleeping? Are you eating enough? Did you drive anywhere this week?" Clark once asked me, twice in the same conversation, whether I had taken my blood pressure medication. He seemed to have forgotten he'd already asked. Or maybe he was hoping I'd forget, I'd answered. I kept a small notebook on the kitchen counter. Every time something happened, a question that felt like a test, an observation that felt like evidence, I wrote it down with the date and time. My students used to call me meticulous. Petra would probably call it paranoid. The distinction matters. In July, Petra's brother came to visit. I didn't know he was a financial advisor until Clark mentioned it offhandedly at the end of a Sunday dinner. He suggested the four of us might sit down together sometime. "Just a conversation," Clark said. "Jean just wants to help." "Help with what exactly?" "With planning. With the house. The accounts. Just so everything's organized." I looked at my son across my kitchen table. He had a piece of my apple cake on his plate, and he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. I thought about the boy who used to sit in that same chair doing multiplication tables, who cried when the dog died, who called me from his college dormitory just to hear my voice. I appreciate the thought, I said carefully, but I have my own people. That was the first time I lied to him. I didn't have anyone yet. But I knew I needed to. The following Monday, I called a woman named Catherine, a real estate attorney I'd known since the early 90s. When she used to come to my classroom to do career talks for my juniors, she was sharp and plain-spoken and did not own a slow, considering nod. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nadine, what you're describing is a pattern. It may not rise to anything legally actionable yet, but you are right to get ahead of it." We met in her office the following Thursday. I brought my notebook. She reviewed everything, asked me several questions, and by the end of our meeting, I had a clear picture of where I stood legally, what my options were, and what steps I could take to protect myself without anyone's signature but my own. I also walked out with the name of a second attorney, an elder law specialist named James, who worked 2 floors up in the same building. Catherine said he was the best in the county for exactly this kind of situation. I made an appointment with him for the week after. I did not mention any of this to Clark. What I did instead was call Clark and tell him I'd been thinking about what he said. That maybe he was right. That maybe it was time to have a real conversation about the house and the finances. He sounded so relieved it made my chest ache. "I'm glad, Mom," he said. "I really think this is the right move." "Let's do it properly," I said. "Come Saturday around 2. We can all sit down together." He agreed immediately. I could hear Petra in the background. Saturday came in gray and cool, the kind of September morning that smells like something ending. I had been up since 6. I made coffee, real coffee, not the instant kind Petra once suggested I switch to, because the regular kind might interfere with your sleep at your age. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook and went through everything one more time, not because I'd forgotten anything, but because I'd taught English long enough to know the value of reviewing your material before a presentation. Catherine arrived at 1:15. James arrived at 1:30. I made them coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table together, going over the documents I'd prepared with their guidance over the previous 2 weeks. Everything was already in order. The living trust, the updated beneficiary designations on my accounts, the letter to my bank, which had already been processed. When Clark's car pulled into the driveway at 2 o'clock, I watched from the kitchen window. He and Petra got out together. She was carrying a folder. Thick, organized. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was talking to her with his head slightly down, the way he does when he's nervous. I let them knock. That was new. I used to leave the door unlocked. I didn't anymore. I opened the door and smiled. "Come in. We're all in the kitchen." Clark stepped inside first, and I saw his face register the 2 people at my table before his brain caught up with what he was seeing. He stopped in the doorway. Petra walked in behind him and stopped too. "Mom, This is Catherine," I said. "And this is James. They're both attorneys. I asked them here today because I thought, if we're having a serious conversation about legal and financial matters, we should probably have legal counsel present." I kept my voice pleasant. Even. Seems like the professional thing to do. No one moved for a moment. Then Clark said, very quietly, "You didn't mention you were bringing anyone. You didn't mention you were bringing Petra's brother to a Sunday dinner until we were already sitting down," I said. "I suppose we both had the same idea about preparation." Petra set her folder on the counter. She didn't open it. We sat down. I won't pretend it was comfortable. It wasn't. Clark sat across from me with his hands flat on the table, and Petra sat beside him, and for a long time no one said very much. Catherine explained who she was and in what capacity she was present. James did the same. Both of them were calm and professional in a way that left no room for the conversation to slide sideways. Clark tried once. He said, "Mom, I don't understand why you felt like you needed—" "Because you've been asking me to sign documents that would transfer control of my finances to you," I said. And when I expressed hesitation, the visits became more frequent and the questions became more pointed. "I don't think you meant harm, Clark. I genuinely don't, but I needed someone in my corner before I sat down at this table." He looked at me for a long time. His jaw was tight. "I was worried about you," he said finally, and I believe he meant it. That's the part that's complicated. I believe he was genuinely worried, and I believe Petra took that worry and shaped it into something that served her. I've taught enough 17-year-olds to know how persuasion works on people who love someone and are a little bit afraid. "I know you were worried," I said, "and I love you for it. But worried and right are not the same thing, and concern doesn't give anyone the right to manage another person's life without their consent, not even a mother's." Petra said nothing. She looked at the folder she hadn't opened. James spent the next 40 minutes walking everyone through exactly what documents I had prepared, what they protected, and what they meant. He was methodical and completely uninterested in anyone's feelings about it, which was exactly what the situation required. By the end, the picture was clear. My finances were protected. My property was properly structured in a trust that I controlled, and there was nothing left for anyone to manage on my behalf because I had already managed it. The folder Petra brought stayed closed the entire time. When they left, Clark hugged me at the door. It was a brief hug, stiff in the way hugs are, when someone doesn't quite know what they're supposed to feel. He didn't say anything. Petra said, "We'll be in touch," in a tone that could have meant anything, and I nodded and closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a while after they drove away. I didn't feel triumphant. That surprises some people when I tell this story. They expect the ending to feel like winning, like a gavel coming down. It didn't feel like that. It felt like grief with clean edges, like losing something you'd already lost, but finally being allowed to know it. I went back to the kitchen. Catherine and James were packing up their things. I thanked them both. James shook my hand and said, "You handled that very well." Catherine just smiled and said she'd be in touch about the final paperwork. I walked them out, then came back and stood in my kitchen for a moment, looking at the table. 4 coffee cups, a plate with a few shortbread cookies I'd set out and nobody had touched. The notebook, closed now, beside the fruit bowl. I picked up my coffee cup, my own, the blue one I've had for 15 years, and this time it was still warm. Clark called 3 days later. Not Petra. Clark. He called on a Wednesday morning while I was reading on the porch, and I let it ring twice before I answered. He said he'd been thinking, that he was sorry. Not in the reflexive way people apologize to end a conversation, but carefully the way my better students used to revise their essays, like he'd actually gone back and looked at what he'd written and decided to do it differently. "I think Petra and I got ahead of ourselves," he said. "I think I let myself believe a story about you that wasn't true. That you needed managing. That you couldn't—" He stopped, started again. "You've never needed managing, Mom. I don't know why I forgot that." I was quiet for a moment. The maple in the front yard had started turning, just at the tips. "I forgive you," I said. "I'm not forgiving Petra yet. That one takes longer. But you, yes." He exhaled. "What do I do about Petra?" "That's a question for a different conversation," I said. "One I'm not having today." We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular, the way we used to. He asked about the garden. I told him the begonias had done beautifully despite the late start, and that I was thinking about putting in a small herb bed along the south fence next spring. "I'll come help," he said. "You're welcome to," I said. "Knock when you get here. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after you've had to prove something about yourself to someone who should never have needed convincing." I felt it for weeks after. Not all the time. Mostly in the evenings, when the house got quiet and I'd catch myself doing some ordinary thing, washing a dish or watering a plant, and the thought would surface, I shouldn't have had to do any of that. But here's what I've learned. From 31 years of standing at the front of a room, trying to hand something true to young people who weren't always sure they wanted it. Knowing what you're worth and making other people see it are not the same skill. The first one lives inside you. The second one sometimes requires documentation, professional witnesses, and the willingness to let someone sit down at your table and come up completely empty. I'm 68 years old. I own this house. I know where my documents are. I know what my accounts hold. I know who my attorneys are, and they know my name. The coffee pot is on. The maple has gone fully red now, all the way to the roots. I am still here. I have always been here, and anyone who wants to have a serious conversation about my future is welcome to sit down, but they should know, going in, that I will be the most prepared person at the table. I always am. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any grand way, just the quiet, practical kind. The kind where you trace a line backward from where you ended up, and you can see, clearly, every choice that led there. Your own and everyone else's. Clark didn't set out to hurt me. I believe that the same way I believe most things I've had to accept about people I love. Slowly, with some resistance, but fully in the end. He saw a mother living alone in a house that was getting harder to keep up, and he felt something that looked like worry. That part was real. What happened next is where the cause and effect gets complicated, because worry passed through Petra on its way to action, and by the time it came out the other side, it didn't look much like worry anymore. It looked like a folder full of documents and a brother-in-law with a business card. That's not a judgment. That's just what happened. What I know about people, and I spent 3 decades watching young people become themselves, so I know a few things, is that intelligence without integrity doesn't protect you. It just makes you better at rationalizing. Clark is a smart man. He talked himself into believing that what he was doing was care. Maybe Petra did too. But somewhere between the concern and the folder, nobody stopped to ask what I actually wanted. Nobody treated me like a person with a point of view worth consulting. That's the thing about dismissing someone's competence. You have to keep doing it. You have to keep finding new evidence, asking the same questions twice, pointing out the cold coffee. Because if you stop, you might have to reckon with the fact that the person was never as diminished as you needed them to be. I spent 31 years teaching young people that real strength isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up early, does the reading, and walks into the room already knowing what it knows. I tried to live that way. I think, in the end, I did. When I sat down at that table with Catherine and James beside me, I wasn't performing. I wasn't punishing Clark. I was just finally in a room where the conversation matched reality, where the documents said what was actually true, and what was actually true was that I had been managing my own life for 68 years, and I intended to keep doing it. The hardest part wasn't the meeting. It was afterward, standing in the hallway, listening to their car back out of the driveway, feeling something I didn't have a clean word for. Not victory. More like the particular sadness of having been right about something you wished you'd been wrong about. But here's what I've come back to. In the week since, the grief and the clarity can exist at the same time. I can love my son and have needed to protect myself from a situation he helped create. Both of those things are true, holding them both without letting one cancel out the other. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of honesty there is. Clark is coming in the spring to help with the herb bed. He'll knock at the door. I'll have coffee ready, and it will still be warm when he gets there. That's enough. For now, it's enough.